Good evening and welcome. Welcome to Kirill Gerstein Invites. You've tuned into our forum, virtual forum. We're still removed from each other, but regulations and restrictions are easing. Nevertheless, it's wonderful to be joined together, and I'm delighted about the forthcoming seminar today with Rachel Beckles Willson. Rachel is a wonderful pianist, educator, educational entrepreneur, and an oud player. She has learned another complex instrument in addition to piano, and she'll talk about the oud, the lute, the connections between the different traditions of music and how they intertwine. And her books range from Orientalism to Cold War Hungary. I first came across her work in a wonderful article about the work and creativity of Georgi Kurtak and Ferenc Rados. Anyway, it's a delight to have her here, and she has a lot to tell us, and I just pass on the word to her. And as usual, your questions are an essential part of the seminar, and your participation is very valued. So after Rachel speaks, do share your thoughts and questions. And welcome, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Kirill. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Well, really, it's a great honor to join you today, and a huge pleasure to feel connected in a new way to what's going on in the rest of the world. So thank you. And today I'm going to talk a little bit in a rather mosaic-like way, relating many different stories, many aspects of the oud, of which you can see 3 examples behind me. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Yes, so to start with, just a brief overview of what I'm most interested in connection with this instrument. I suppose there are 2 areas. One is that I'll start with an anecdote. According to various 9th century Arab philosophers, the first oud was built from bones, and it was a descendant of Cain called Lamech, who lost his son. And he was distraught, and he hung the body from a tree, and he vowed that he wouldn't look away until the entire body had disintegrated. But as he watched and the body disintegrated, he started to see a form emerging, and in the end he took it down and he made an instrument from it, and he played and sang the first lament. And this story seems to me to encapsulate the sort of fantastical aspect of this instrument. It's not just an instrument that people play, it carries an enormous weight of storytelling and emotion with it. So that's one area I'm very interested in. The other area is really that as a European, I've encountered the lute from the perspective of being European and seeing the oud as other. So as if there's a straight line dividing my culture from Arab, Turkish, Persian cultures. And this is something that we need to overcome. So in my talk, I'll be looking at the different ways of doing that, combining these 2 areas, really. So the oud, I'll just start with some very basic historical fragments, really, which we can piece together. This image comes from an archaeological dig at Airtam, and this is in current Pakistan, Afghanistan area, Central Asia, and it's where we find the earliest examples of the short-necked lute as opposed to the long-necked one. So it's not entirely clear, but I think probably from this example on the right, you can see it's likely that this instrument was made from 1 piece of wood, whereas long-necked instruments were made from 2 pieces, so a box and a stick stuck to it. So there seem to be 2 quite different histories, the long-necked lute having a much longer history back to ancient Egypt, and the short-necked lute probably emerging around this time in Gandhara. From this relief, we can sense that there's something very syncretic. It looks Dionysian. On the left, there's a woman with an amphora, as if there's a Hellenistic influence here, which is very likely given the history of this time. On the other hand, we know that this particular temple was connected to Buddhist worship. So we have a mixture that doesn't make much sense to us now from our historical perspective of goddess worship, serpents, deities, and a mixture of Hellenistic and Buddhist worship. This was very likely influenced also by various Chinese tribes who were moving west at the time. So it's really to an empire with more sort of firmer material traces that we have to turn to find the next stage in the history of this instrument. And that's Persia. In the 6th century, there are numerous objects with instruments carved into them, such as this one on the left. You can see there's a short-necked lute there. the difference, I think, here that we can see is that rather than the instrument being connected to the worship of a deity, it's connected to the adulation of a human being. We're at the time of really material worship and enormous social hierarchies emerging. So Sasanian Persia seems to have been a time of very rich music culture. And in fact, the Sasanian music culture would spread into the Ottoman Empire and form the foundations of the music culture there. It's in the Sasanian time that we encounter, through legend, through historical writing, perhaps the first the first oud player to enter history, and his name was Barbad. And the instrument that he played was known in Persian as barbat, which is the one that you can see there. We're on very shaky territory because the texts about Barbat were written many, many centuries after he allegedly lived. But there seems to be a history there of courtly musicians. Of course, the oud, as it's now called, is associated most strongly really with the Arab world. And this is the earliest image we have of an oud in the Arab world, where it had certainly spread by the 8th century. It's very likely that there were ouds long before the word oud was used. There's a glossing that happened. Ouds were called various things, including barbat, sanj, were many words. And there must have been lute-like instruments in the Hijaz, so in the whole of Arabia, before philosophers, historians started really writing about this one called oud. Now, oud is the Arab word for wood and may refer to the fact that the instrument was wood, or the fact that it was plucked with a plectrum that may originally have been wood. This is one I have here, which is actually not wood at all. As you can see, these days it's not common to use wood. People use plastic. They may use eagle feathers if they have a legal source of eagle feathers, or an illegal one. They may use bone. There are many variations. In this particular floor painting, we can see the oud clearly was made from one piece of wood. And in the literature, we can discern that it's one of two types of oud that were circulating at the time. And this was called the Persian oud, as distinct from the Arab one. So in this time, just as we can see from the stone reliefs at Ertan, there were probably multiple types of short-necked lute around. And it's really in the 9th century, in the so-called golden age of Arab culture, that we have a sense of the oud developing as a core instrument and being a really central part of a music culture and leaving very, very numerous traces. And from that time, I think it's really been associated most with Arab culture. So moving on, I have an unashamedly very low-tech demonstration here that I'd just like to share. And I'm interested in the various different centers of oud playing that emerged between the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. So moving from Kufa to Damascus, the invasion of the Abbasids, first of all, was a rival clan to the ruling Umayyads. That sent the Umayyad clan into exile in North Africa and Spain. And the Abbasids then founded their new capital down in Baghdad. And Baghdad became one of the major centers of intellectual and musical life in the Arab world. Meanwhile, the Umayyad dynasty spread, and so did the oud. So the oud spread through Spain into France, through Sicily into Italy, and up into Germany. Now, these are very straight lines. They're the straight lines of history, and they can tell us a limited amount about what the life was like of this instrument, what the contexts were, what the music was, in fact. And I want to break this down a little bit more going on. For now, though, let's look at some of the traces of the oud in Europe. Cappella Palatina in Palermo, in Sicily. This is from the roof, and we can see clearly here two forms of oud. And then rather later on, in Spain, it wasn't just a decorative instrument for Europeans. Increasingly, they actually played it. So this is an illustrated manuscript showing that this oud, which is by then, it's difficult to know exactly whether this extraordinarily large instrument is a part of, was really that large, or whether this is an iconographical convention. Certainly that would have been an extremely difficult oud to balance, I think. Yeah. So as the oud spread, it changed. Inevitably, the styles of European music making changed it. There was an gradual interest in contrapuntal music, which meant that Europeans stopped using the plectrum and started using their fingers because it was easier to play different voices with fingers. In the meantime, although the oud arrived in Europe with frets, and the frets were continued in Europe, the oud was losing its frets. And that's part of a story of complexity that I can return to later. That blue line down is showing how there was a movement of luthiers. So when Italy became a center for composition of lute music, and there was a rich market for lutes, the very strong school of German luthiers took advantage of this, and large numbers of them moved down, so escaping very difficult circumstances in Germany. And we see Venice and Bologna becoming, in the 15th century, 14th, 15th century, 16th century even, very important heartlands for the making of lutes. Finally, of course, we come to the very difficult moments in which the Pope was applying a great deal of pressure to Europe to spread Christianity, and gradually the presence of the Muslims in Europe was removed, so that there were fewer and fewer, and then there were none, and we had this very sharp division, I think, in consciousness of between Christian countries and the notion of Muslim countries as other, and a very strong dichotomy. This sort of dichotomy is also something we see in the music world, particularly in tonal systems. So the rise of equal temperament, the spread of equal temperament, the spread of instruments, the Industrial Revolution spreading equal temperament throughout the world, created a sense that there's one real tonality, and then there are all these others. This dichotomy can also sense in the notion of there being a classical music that is European or Euro-American, and elsewhere there being a folk tradition or numerous folk traditions. So this dichotomy of classical and folk grew up. There's the idea of composing. So composition in Europe, that being a thing that the classical tradition propagates, whereas outside Europe, the notion being that it's improvisation, it's free. And most deeply, perhaps, the idea that Europe is in advance and that all the other countries are somehow historical relics of Europe. And this sort of thinking, of course, enabled the types of very grasping colonial advances that we see in my blue arrow going from Paris to Egypt, and the Napoleonic invasion, and all the European powers really fighting over North Africa, Africa, and the Middle East. Why does this matter for music so much? Well, one interesting area that it matters for the oud is one of the byproducts of Napoleon's invasion. He took enormous numbers of scientists with him. I forget the numbers. 200 and something scientists traveled with Napoleon's entourage. And they consulted Egyptians in order to create this extraordinary set of books about Egypt, a description of Egypt. I think there are 10 volumes of text and 7 volumes of plates. And the plates are really huge. I mean, you know, the volumes, they are this kind of size right off my screen, enormous leather-bound, heavy tomes of knowledge. And when the scientists brought back this knowledge, they also brought back many objects. And they were able then to portray them in the books. And so here we can see in the right-hand corner an oud that came to Europe around 1800 as a result of the Napoleonic invasion. And it's described here and measured in enormous detail. This oud is lost, which you might think is not surprising at all. Of course it's lost. How could it have survived 221 years? However, many of the instruments in Napoleon's collection have survived. They're in museums. They were sold variously into private hands. The person who invented the saxophone, Adolphe Sax, actually had a collection of instruments, including some of them. And some of the wind instruments are still housed in the Brussels Museum of Musical Instruments. It would be wonderful if this oud existed, but I haven't managed to find it yet. So the result of Napoleon's visit and numerous other colonial expeditions is that on the north side of this line, on the north of the north-south divide, and on the west of the east-west divide, we have all sorts of objects, including musical instruments, silent musical instruments held in museums and private collections. And in some of my forthcoming research, I'm exploring what we do with these instruments, because they've been cut off from where they came from. They're cut off from their histories, they're cut off from their stories, the communities that actually understand what they're about. Let's have a look for a moment, though, about how we can push this further. Even though the instrument brought by Napoleon is missing, the museum in Brussels has what is probably the oldest surviving oud, which you can see in the glass case there. And this was brought to Europe in 1839, thanks to the initiative of François-Joseph Fétis. Fétis was a European of his time, in the sense of encyclopedic in his ambition. If there was a colonial movement dedicated to taking the land and controlling the space, there has also been a colonial imperialistic desire to categorize the world in terms of how we think about it. So what are the names we give things? What categories do we put them into? What hierarchies do we create for them? And so Fetis's ambition was to write a history of all the musics of the entire world. And he got in touch with the Belgian consul in Alexandria and asked for his help. And the consulate there got in touch with his network, an engineer in particular, who was extremely helpful. And the result was that a large collection of instruments was sent from Egypt to Belgium to furnish Fetis's study. And so the general history that he then wrote, you would hope, would be deeply informed by these instruments. In fact, what we discover, if we look at it in detail, is that he didn't look very closely at the instruments, and he tended to rely on the texts that he had at his disposal. So Fetis's description of his oud doesn't actually match this instrument. It matches the instrument of Napoleon. And I should have mentioned that the study of that oud was written by the French musicologist Villottot in the History of Egypt that was commissioned by Napoleon. The description of Egypt. So Fetis based his description of the oud on Villottot and on a Latin translation of a 9th or 10th century Arabic philosopher, Al-Farabi. He also lifted a picture from a book by the English Edward Lane of an oud player and reproduced it in his book. So while it would be nice to think that this oud had really played a part in the European historical understanding, it's not an obvious support to his work. We might wonder why. And in order to answer that, it's quite useful to understand the sort of framework that someone like Fetis was working with. And that brings us to these lines I drew on the map and this east-west, north-south divide. If we look at what Fetis says in his history, the history of music is inseparable from appreciation of the special properties belonging to the races that have cultivated it. This essentially ideal art owes its existence to the humans who create it, the product of human faculties which are distributed unequally. And the feeling for music for nations as well as individuals is related to the shape of the brain. So for Fetis, it was important to slot the oud and the various instruments and traditions he was writing about into the racist thinking of the time, according to which there was a hierarchy of human beings and a hierarchy of brain types, a hierarchy of musicianship. And the hierarchy was, in a sense, social, intellectual, so it was up down, but it was also kind of horizontal in that it was temporal. There was an idea that people from outside Europe were at an earlier, less civilized stage of existence, of human development. So while Fetis may seem to be one of the pinions of writing about music, we should never forget to read him critically and to understand that while there may be some knowledge there that's very valuable, there's also a very, very problematic framework that we need to see, really, just understand. So what are the alternatives for these straight lines? I think really the best we can do is think about entanglements. So all these cultures are coming together in ways that we cannot grasp in total. We can't really separate It's not that the categories really work. We need to look at what gets called friction. So friction in anthropology refers to the sort of the transformations that happen when certain powers get introduced into new locations, how localities respond to new ideas, how they take them on, how they make them their own. It's a dynamic process. So that's one thing to look at. Another thing to look at rather than difference is points of intersection, points of touching, points even of similarity, and even points of sameness. And to do that, of course, we have to draw different lines. They might not be lines between north and south or lines between east and west. They'd be lines of connection across these various divisions. So that's one of the things I'm interested in. And in the next slide, I'd like to introduce that with actually a piece of music and something that sort of subverts some of the dichotomies, the categories I was mentioning before. So this is a composition, and it was composed at the time of Napoleon by Selim III, who was a sultan in the Ottoman Empire at the time. And so it's a composition. You can see from the title, Hijaz. I don't know, some of you may be familiar with this Hijaz. I selected this because Hijaz is perhaps the most well-known concept, a sort of Orientalist concept referring to a sound of an augmented second. But Hijaz is a mode. Saz refers to the instrument, and then Samai is a classical genre in the Ottoman tradition. So we have here a classical composition. It comes from a world of modality, comes from a world of genres, comes from a world of notating music. I'm going to play it, this recording, and you'll notice that the tuning is not exactly what you would expect because of that modal world from which it's coming, which is not equal temperament. Just a few more words about this piece. You can see it's got this extraordinary time signature of 10/8. The Ottoman tradition in general is structured according to these, they're called usuls, so they're rhythmic cycles. They may be as long as 128 beats. And when they're that long, it makes more sense really to think of them as structures, like sections of music. But these meters, these cycles aren't about the number of beats. It isn't really about the fact that it has 10 beats. It's about groupings. So the samai rhythm is 3, 2, 2, 3, which adds up to 10, but it's this groupings that give the rhythm. It's actually called an aksak samai, which is what Bartók referred to as limping rhythms. So he came across quite similar types of rhythm, and they are very widespread. And the samai is one that actually entered the classical tradition. Of course, because it was part of a tradition, an empire that spread very widely, the samai itself spread very widely, and there are numerous samais written in the Arab world, for example. The mode itself, as you can perhaps hear, the C sharp is flatter than it would be on a piano, and the B flat is higher, it's sharper. So that the interval of the augmented fourth, this famous sound of Hijaz, is actually, it has a character that's quite different from what you might expect. The modality is where the complexity, or one of the areas of the complexity in this tradition. Whereas in the Western classical tradition, we have two modes, major and minor. There are literally hundreds in the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps there are 50 core modes, known as makam, which have been used to generate large amounts of repertoire. But at the time of Selim and also beyond, it was a sign of prestige to actually create your own mode. And Selim himself is associated with the creation of certain modes. We might come back to that later. So a mode is not just a collection of notes, just as the rhythmic cycle is not a collection of beats. It's actually a melodic development. There's a certain codified way of using a mode that involves certain movements from one group of notes to another, and certain types of ascent, certain types of descent. And what we would call microtonal inflections are what give the most sophisticated musicians their greatest strength, I think, what they're most admired for. This microtonal complexity is also something that varies regionally to an enormous degree. So were this piece to be played by someone from Iraq on an oud, for example, this unfretted instrument, the intervals would be very different from if they were played by an oud player from Istanbul. And it would be different again if the player was in Damascus in Syria. So these are the regional differences that give a richness. I'm pointing that out because it's another way of getting beyond these straight lines, the division of East and West and North and South, because within even this territory I'm talking about, where modal music has been so influenced by the Sasanian and then the Ottoman Empire, there is enormous diversity and enormous variety. Within the Ottoman classical tradition, we can see from the names of the composers that some of them may have come from Persia. Some of them were certainly part of the Armenian community of Istanbul. Some of them were part of the Greek community of Istanbul. Many of them were Turkish as well. But even within that tradition, there was an enormous amount of diversity. You may also have heard that there's a sort of heterophony going on in this performance, so that each of the instruments has a different way of ornamenting this melody, and it gives a texture and a sense of momentum that's very characteristic, and it's part of the pedagogical process, learning how to make a melody idiomatic for the instrument that you're playing. So this example is demonstrating a classical tradition and alerts us to the fact that really it might make more sense to draw lines between elite cultures and less privileged cultures. So it's a culture of education and privilege when there is notation, for example, when there are people that have the time to learn to read, study. So I'm going to pursue this stratification for a moment, because the oud has been involved in some quite high-flying, let's say, exchanges. It's not just the sound of the instrument that's interesting here, but also just the instrument as an object and what it may represent. Building on the case of Fétis, I would like to mention the world expos that European powers started to organize during the 19th century. The Great Exhibition of London, and then the Exposition Universelle in Paris. These enormous exhibitions were displays of European industry, and they were also displays of other cultures. And as scholars have shown, there was an incredible hierarchy even in the architectural distribution of the display spaces, that you could trace the various power dynamics that were at play. But in a remarkable exchange, it turns out that Ismail Pasha, who is the Khedive, the ruler of Egypt, gave 25 instruments to the curator of the South Kensington Museum in London in 1867, following this exhibition. So he was evidently displaying instruments. Perhaps he had an ensemble of instrumental players there. And this was a piece of international diplomacy, so that this instrument traveled from France to England. And when it got there, it was put in the catalogue of the South Kensington Museum. And it was referred to, as you can see in the top right corner, as a mandolin. So later that's been crossed out, and it's been referred to as an oud correctly. And in one sense, you might think, well, they didn't know what they were doing. Who would know what all these objects were? Fair enough. And there could be another reason as well, which is that what arrived didn't look like the oud as described by Villottot or Fétis or Edward Lane. It looked like this, and it had a rather different sort of shape. The body was longer in relation to the neck, and it only had 4 double courses of strings, whereas those which had already appeared in the literature had 6 or even 7. This instrument was part of what was then called the South Kensington Museum, and then was integrated into what became known as the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it was an educational space, but not for music. It was actually for design and woodwork. So this instrument entered a space in which its visual properties, perhaps, were what really mattered. As I showed in the close-up, it's really beautifully decorated. The carving is straight into the face with the rosette, but it's got these semi-precious stones. So it was evidently conceived as an instrument for the elite. But there it sat silently as an object in a museum, and I don't think it's ever been played since, not since 1867. It's still there. And it's one of these objects that needs its story told. Because of course it belongs to a culture, it belongs to a world of sound and music making. In fact, although it was donated by the Khedive of Egypt, we're slightly puzzled as to how he came by it, because it doesn't really belong to the Egyptian traditions at all. It belongs to the Tunisian musical tradition, which is very distinct. And it is, in fact, an oud arbi, which is the terminology used for these North African smaller ouds with relatively short necks. And it's a matter of speculation as to how an Egyptian ruler gave Tunisian instruments to London, really. As you can hear, I'll just play an example. This is very different from the Ottoman Turkish style of playing, which I shared earlier. Here, what you'll experience is an introduction, an improvisatory but highly codified introduction to a song, first of all. And so the player is exposing the mode and following various types of melodic pattern in order to set the scene for the song that he's going to sing. Characteristic of the oud arbi playing is a strumming. So it's much less to do with the single lines as to do with strumming, which is also to do with the very particular tuning. Let's hope this works. want to turn now to a very different instrument. This one is made in Damascus, as you can see, 1885, and another historical instrument. And it's another one that found its way to England. It's stored in the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester, and it was part of a private collection before it arrived there. And we don't actually know more than that. So it doesn't seem to have been part of an obvious colonial exchange. But I think this instrument helps us think in a very textured way, rather than through that kind of sense of East-West dichotomy. As you can see, it's very beautifully carved. So this rosette with a geometric design must have been made by hand at the time. These days, these rosettes are carved with laser, but at that time, of course, that wasn't possible. The maker, Yusuf Nahat, is the first in a dynasty of Nahat makers, who are probably the most celebrated oud makers ever. And he's also perhaps one of the first oud makers to put a label inside his ouds saying his name. The earlier ouds, such as the one I've shown you in Brussels and the one in the V&A, don't have any label inside with the name of the maker. So why is this oud so interesting? If you can notice at the bottom of the rosette on the left-hand side, there's a bit of damage, there's a hole. And through that hole, I managed to put an endoscope and have a look inside. Now, looking beyond the rosette for me is always one of the most exciting things. And what you normally find is something, in fact, like this. So this rosette is from an oud made by the same maker, Yusuf Nahat, and this one is at the Royal College of Music in London. This is also from a private collection. And beyond the rosette, you find a label. Actually, often it's a label with a picture of a man with a moustache, if it's from the Ottoman times, or even two men with two moustaches, because there were often luthier brothers who worked together. This particular one just says that it was made in Damascus by Yusuf Nahat. So I expected something like that, because it's an oud of the same period, but instead I found this. So this woman is inside the oud, and so is this set of characters, and this one. So this oud seems to have been in England, in Manchester, without being opened up, without having any changes made to it. And yet it was made with all this extraordinary kind of bucolic European scene. It's like a picnic scene. There's wine being poured and utterly mysterious. So Yusuf Nahat in Damascus papered the inside of his oud with a picture of Europe, high-class European society. It's really, I think, an example of how we must think about interconnections. Yusuf Nahat wasn't working in a vacuum in Damascus. Presumably he had Europeans who wanted to buy instruments. There was a trade of instruments. There was a fascination in Europe with beautiful objects in the 19th century. There was a fashion for orientalist painting. There was a culture of increasing one's prestige through the purchase of beautiful objects and decorating one's home with beautiful objects. It's a cultural capital. And one such example is the former owner of the oud in the Royal College of Music. I showed this one, George Donaldson, Sir George Donaldson, who had a large collection of instruments and 18th century furniture, and he gave all his instruments to the Royal College of Music, which became then the Donaldson Museum of Instruments. So he's a very classic case. He was dealing, he was buying objects. So evidently a lute maker, an oud maker in Damascus may have had that market in mind, or may have even had a buyer who wanted to show some kind of interaction. So this is one of the mysteries. So I hope I've shown some of the ways that you need to think really about hierarchies in a different way, to do with class and privilege, court, and recognize parallels across the divides, recognize very similar types of culture. There's another thing we can do, which is to think in more subtle ways about the movement of people. And this is a very interesting piece of research showing the enormously kind of multidimensional and complex movements of people from the 9th to the 11th century. The trafficking of people, you might think, is a long way from the world of music. You would be very wrong in the case of the 9th century and even the 8th century. So when I first started exploring the oud and started trying to play it, one of the ways in which I felt very odd was because I'm a woman, and almost everybody I met who offered to teach me or support me was a man. So I felt like a complete anomaly. But in 7th or 8th century Baghdad or Damascus, the anomaly would have been a man playing the oud. And the culture of the Abbasid court in Baghdad in the 9th century, particularly earlier on, actually, the 7th, 8th century, depended entirely on slave women called qiyan. Qiyan were highly educated slaves. They were trained in music. They were expected to recite poetry. They were expected to improvise poetry, improvise music, sing, be entertainers in all senses of the word. They were also sexually available, but they were a class of women that was above the less educated class. So another way we might think about overcoming the East-West or North-South division is to think about the movement of women and the lives of women as musicians, as oud players over the centuries. And bearing that in mind, I'd just like to look now at, very briefly, at experiences in 4 different places that seem really quite remote from one another, but have what I would call strong affinities when it comes to the lives of women at certain times. So there's England, there's southern Spain, there's Venice, very specific, and Baghdad. Venice perhaps is the one most familiar through perhaps the tradition of painting. When the English traveller and writer Thomas Coriat published his 2-volume account of his 5 months travel through Europe in 1608, he referred to Venice as a highly dangerous place because of the courtesans there. I quote from him, "The courtesans will endeavor to enchant thee, partly with her melodious notes that she warbles out upon her lute." So the style of dress gives these women away. the role of the courtesan in Venice was famous. The courtesans were a crucial part of the civic economy. They paid taxes. So although there was lip service given to morality and ethics, they were a crucial part of the society. The Catholic Church also, in principle, was against adultery and promiscuity, but exercised at least tolerance. So courtesans also were welcome in the churches. So coming back to this map and thinking about Venice there, we need some names. So who were these women and what were their lives like? So I'm going to refer to my notes because I have quite a lot of detail now. The earliest courtesan from Venice that we have any detailed information about was called Elisabetta Condulma. And she was born in Venice in the 1490s. And we know from the possessions she left on her death that she was a musician. So she had 4 lutes in her home, and there were plentiful chairs there to accommodate an audience for concerts. And her apartment was lavishly furnished and hung with contemporary paintings, both sacred and profane. So family honor tended to decide whether or not a woman became a courtesan. And it's very likely that Elizabeth had to become a courtesan because of her mother's rather doubtful status and the very modest legacy that she won from her father, who had been a nobleman. She managed to get hold of the family house. She bought out her brother's shares. Presumably she'd earned the money through being a courtesan, and she secured herself a husband. Now that might sound like a sort of contradiction in terms, but it's likely that this husband, who was called Gabriele de Angeli, was a convenience because it enabled her to avoid certain very restrictive legislation. And on her death, she had 7 children from 3 other men, and she left those children the bulk of her legacy. So if Elisabetta was the first one we really know about, Paola Provenzin was probably one of the last. She's a later courtesan. She died in 1638. And her apartment was on Piazza San Marco, and it had been rented for her by a noble patron, Tommaso Contarini. And he also funded her training in music and painting and poetry. So again, her apartment was lavishly furnished with paintings and damask and leather. And she left a mass of musical scores and an array of musical instruments, including lutes, numerous lutes, and a spinet and a harpsichord. So she lived at a time which was a little bit better than the time of Elisabetta for women, because until about 1350, Italian society had been quite integrated and women had been able to be out in the public sphere. But after that time, there were increasing legislation, new laws, which made it very difficult to be out for women. They weren't allowed to be working, and the courtesan was the only role left. It's the only way that they could actually earn their living. Excuse me. So I wanted to talk also about Irene, and I've lost my information about her. So Irene was not a courtesan. Finding my notes. Irene was an upper class woman, and she was allowed to play domestically from the age of 3. When she was actually an orphan, she was orphaned. She was brought up by her maternal grandfather, who enabled her to study painting with none other than Tiziano. And she studied music with the lutenist Bartolomeo Gazza and composer Ippolito Trombocino. So her biographer observed that while Irene was enormously ambitious and competitive about her skills, she always behaved decorously as a gentlewoman. So with this kind of world of the courtesan and the orphan brought up to play domestically and behaving decorously, we're getting towards this very strong ambivalence about music that is linked very powerfully with the lute in Europe, as we're seeing, and with the oud. And so it's time to introduce two more women. Now, Arib and Ulaya have very contrasted lives. Arib was a qiyan, so she was a slave, very much like in Venice. She was trained and was obliged to use song and poetry and repartee, as well as sexual services, in order to make her living. It would be difficult to overemphasize the importance of musicians such as Arib, because there was absolutely no court event in the 8th century, 9th century that didn't depend on hosts of these women playing. Arib was one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous. And she was bought by her first owner was the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. She was then acquired by the Caliph al-Amin, and she was eventually freed. And numerous historical sources attest to her outstanding skills as a singer and composer. She had over 1,000 songs to her name, which were all preserved in notebooks and loose sheets. She played and she taught the oud, and she was a poet. She was skilled in calligraphy, along with popular games, backgammon and chess. Another reason that she's very famous in the history is that she earned so much money to be able to set herself up independently and employ and train numerous slaves of her own. So that's the case of Arib. Someone such as Arib would have been dependent on nobility or a caliph, and her honor would have also depended on having an owner. Owners, on the other hand, needed their slaves in order to emphasize their own cultural capital, to demonstrate their own strength in the world. I'd like to contrast Arib, who was out in the world and on display, with the life of Ulaya, who was actually born into a noble family and was married and was a brother of the caliph. Now, Ulaya could never be seen and could never be acknowledged as the composer of her own music. So Ulaya had what you might think of as a higher status, not being a slave. On the other hand, was constrained to be unseen and heard through closed doors in a remarkable anecdote, description of the caliph wanting to share the beauty of this music. We read that he led one of his courtiers to a pavilion in the grounds and knocked the door, and then led him through this door and then locked the door behind him. And then he knocked at the next door, then he unlocked that, went through and locked it. And this went on, and gradually they started to hear the sound of the oud being played. And and they got closer and closer, and eventually they heard the sound of singing. But they never saw the woman, and they had to appreciate the woman, the music from the outside. So this is the difference of two women living in apparently very one society, but in different strata of the society, and the different types of freedom that women had at that time. I just want to flick back here momentarily to remind you of this extraordinary traffic of people before we go to Qalam in southern Spain. So Qalam, which means pen, is also the name of a slave musician and oud player and composer. We don't know what her original name was, because she was known as Pen, which must mean that she had the role of a scribe. She was captured in Iberia, so she was originally Spanish, and she was sent to Medina for training. The school of the Medinese was particular. It was very distinct from the musical school of Baghdad. And then she was brought back, and she was housed in the house of the Medinese singers. And she was then one of the most celebrated and professional, recognized singers and musicians of the Umayyad court in southern Spain. I'd like to finish this tour of women, or no, she's the penultimate one, with Mary. Mary in England. Mary's time coincides really with the end of the popularity of the lute in England, which happened somewhat later than it did in continental Europe. The golden age was really the beginning of the 17th century, when the lute had really died out in Europe. And I find Mary an interesting case. She's called Mary Burford, and she published a lute tutor, because there's this same fascination with the sort of anthropomorphic quality of the lute, the way it's involved in certain types of seduction or anxiety, but in a very different way, really. So for Mary, did I say Burford? Her name is Burwell, excuse me, the lute tutor. It's really about domesticating and taming the seductive potential of the woman with the lute. And I'm going to quote from her lute tutor, in which she says, "The beauty of the arm, of the hands, and of the neck are advantageously displayed in the playing of the lute. The eyes are employed only in looking upon the company. Nothing represents so well the concert of angelical choirs, and gives more foretastes of the heavenly joys and of everlasting happiness. For the advantages of marriage, how many bachelors and maids have we seen advanced by this agreeing harmony?" So her advice to women was, learn the lute, and that way you will secure yourself a husband. Just one final female I would like to mention is Dilhayat Khalfa, who lived at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century in Constantinople, Istanbul. And she is one of the first female composers at the Ottoman court. She was distinguished enough to even create her own mode, which is called efchara, and she composed numerous pieces in classical forms and numerous songs. So Dilhayat Khalfa is an example really of a woman who managed to get into the upper echelons of the musical establishment, in comparison with somebody like Arib or Elisabetta. I'm coming to the end of sort of presentation prepared. So there are many directions we could go in conversation. I suppose I'd just like to round off by mentioning again that one more way of breaking down this kind of duality is to remember constructing the earliest Islamic history, or the earliest history of this instrument that's been so associated with the Arab world. One of the most important sources is by the Arab philosopher Al-Kindi, his treatise on melodies and notes. And in this, we see very clearly that he's deeply influenced by Plato and also Pythagoras. So he's really trying to rationalize using Pythagorean measurements, the measurements of the ouds that he sees. So he comes out with ratio, proportions. And it doesn't stop there. When we look at how the lute developed in Europe, we find that there were Pythagorean principles which were taken forward in how lutes were constructed in different sizes, in ratios of 1:2. So lute families expanded in Pythagorean proportions. His thinking was Platonic in the sense of the notion of the music of the spheres. For Al-Kindi, the oud was a body. It was music was a microcosm, just as was the human body. Each of the strings of the oud had a particular physical parallel. The strings were associated with the elements: earth, fire, air, and water. They were also associated with the spirits, the humors. And we see in Europe, with Galileo, with the theorization of the lute, exactly the same principles coming forward. The geometry that we see in the rosettes of lutes comes directly from this tradition, evidently, of ouds. The strings traditionally were colored. Many Europeans traveling in the Middle East and North Africa noticed these colored strings, and the early staff of Guido d'Arezzo, which seems to have been taken from strings, had this colored red line corresponding to one of the oud strings. Finally, while the shape of the lute became more elongated and also increased the number of strings enormously, in Venice in the 17th century and late 16th century, 17th century, there was a style of lute that was once again built that was fatter and in a shape more reminiscent of the oud. And some historians have said, well, it was a throwback. There must have been some kind of nostalgia, but Venice was still very connected to the East. And it's just as likely, I think, that there was a continuing influence. Certainly the woods that were available in Venice, which had come from the East, were very much sought after by luthiers, specifically because of that availability there in that gateway. I think I'll stop there and we could get into a more conversational mode so I can respond to the interests of listeners. Is that all right, Kirill?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's
Shall I stop sharing?
If you're not going to show something else, then yes, people will be able to see you.
I could share something else later if
yes. So we can restart. Thank you. It's absolutely brilliant, and I have lots of questions, and I'm sure our participants as well. But perhaps I'll start picking at the theme that you mentioned a number of times: this breaking down of barriers. And in this breaking down of barriers, I would like to ask you, how much do we know, how much do you think the European so-called classical composers heard this tradition of the oud, and do you trace and do you see traces of this tradition in the, let's say, earlier classical music? I mean, so let's say Vivaldi. How much do we expect he would have heard this, and how much do you think you can discern this? So, in this sense, how are the barriers up or broken down?
Hmm. I think I've never thought about the case of Vivaldi, to be honest.
I just pick Vivaldi. You know, we are in Venice, and Venice being the cultural crossroads. So why not mention him? But you know, I could.
You're right, and it's a question I hadn't posed at all. I mean, I think we're more familiar, or I'm more familiar with thinking about the case of the siege of Vienna and the alla turca. And there are many cases, it might not be the oud, but those types of intervals and those types of rhythmic patterns that were heard perhaps from military music coming from the East could have been heard. But as we know from all sorts of other situations, when the military arrives, it isn't necessarily the best way for listening to music. It's just, you don't get the.
It's a very particular kind of cultural dissemination and export.
Yeah, so maybe they had the Mechta ensemble, the Ottoman military ensemble. If you think of the alla turca of Mozart.
Yes, no, this of course, but I was just wondering specifically whether there is evidence or your impressions of so-called classical composers, Western classical composers, being somehow influenced by that kind of tradition, the oud tradition.
I think it would come into the sort of framework of exoticism. So exoticism and orientalism. So if I compare it with my own compositional work, it's an enormously, there is a kind of, there is a barrier. So for example, I have actually gone inside the world of mode. I have studied composition in terms of Ottoman mode. I've composed in Ottoman classical genres, and I can improvise in Ottoman classical genres. This means that I have started to speak that language in a sense. I don't speak it on the level of many other people that have done it more, but I speak it. Now, I don't think that Vivaldi spoke that language. I don't think he made that effort because he didn't want to, he didn't need to, his work was going elsewhere. So if you're composing in a tradition and you're adding to that tradition, then you may want to draw something in from the outside in order to be new. And I think that would be the case. It could be the case. I've never thought about it in the context of Vivaldi. And this continued, of course, throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th century with Debussy. But it's not a deep influence. It's like a color.
Mm-hmm. And same would be your impression for England and the lute tradition in England, that they would have not been so influenced by the let's say the Ottoman or the Moorish music sound.
Well, what I think is interesting is that as a part of the wave of historically informed performance, which took off, 60s, 70s, 80s, there was more and more interest in trying to recover and replicate or revivify old performing traditions. There was the turn then to North African instruments and players. And the work of Jordi Savall is a case in point. But there were earlier attempts, in particular for music of southern Spain, Iberia, so these regions. And creating performances and recordings that also use North African instruments to try to get a kind of Andalusian sound. And that was one of the strands, I think, of performance practice that developed in recent Baroque performance practice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But can well be that at the time, in actual performance, there was much more trace, but what got written down doesn't necessarily tell us about that.
Yes. So about what got written down, this was another question that came to my mind when you were speaking, and also showing us this notated piece. How much was notated? And I'm talking even not so much the 19th century, but you are going as far back as the 11th century. But let's say take the middle ground, 16th, 17th century. How much was notated, and how was it notated? Or was the process of notating it a kind of a westernizing conversion because they were not going to notate it, or not notated, and that's in that notation system? So can you talk a little bit about notation in the old times?
Sure. So in the Ottoman era, for really a long time, there was a system of notation which was invented by the Armenian composer Hamparsum. So the Hamparsum system of notation is something that has been used, understood, and transcribed. So, for example, what the score that I showed you is a transcription of Hamparsum notation. In the Ottoman era, they started score notation as a result of visits by Europeans. But the repository, the very large repositories of manuscripts that we have, are largely in Hamparsum notation and have to be transcribed and have been transcribed. Through those, we get a sense of centuries of music being kind of compressed and probably quite standardized. Some of them have the title, or sort of some of them are grouped according to the music of outsiders, Ajamler, that means the foreigners. So we assume that those are much older Persian compositions, probably known to be associated with the Persian musicians at the court, in the Ottoman court. And others are more contemporary and have, they may be Jewish or Turkish or many other different types of composers. But yes, there is a history of notation, various notations.
And actually, there's a question from Catherine Santo. Can you show some examples of the music writing of, for instance, the piece by Selim III? But perhaps any
Hamparsum notation.
Yes, I that would be my impression. But in any case, it would be wonderful if you have any examples that you can find, or point us to a link. I think that would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can try to find something and share it. So you see, so I could just this is what Google comes up with. I have. Now let's look at
just any example, just to have an impression. And so you said one of the, if I understood correctly, one of the reasons was to notate it indeed for, so to say, European export, but also was it for preservation of the pieces, or was it to enable ensemble playing, or because I'm quite curious about this transition from improvised music to notated music.
Mm-hmm. So just one moment. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So here is Hamparsum notation. It's based on the based on the alphabet. Here you can see how certain letters correspond to certain transcribed notes, and here the dots being used to determine the rhythmic values. And here is an actual phrase. As you will imagine, it's an area where there are a lot of disputes to how,
Yes, I was going to.
things should be transcribed. I mean, transcription is an interpretation.
We have a kind of a Rosetta Stone from the time where there was some piece.
A key.
Yes, in two notations that one could compare, or no?
Not so far as I know.
Okay, well, it's a nice idea. And these this notation, is that still in use today, or has that largely been abandoned?
It's been abandoned, but it's a matter for scholarship, so it's very much in discussion. As to, I don't know about export. I mean, the large collections we have seem to have been created as archives, so really kind of consolidations of the music at the court. Musicians were trained to learn music and perform music by ear, rather than through reading. Yeah, so it's much more a kind of time capsule.
Incidentally, do you think that notation was sight readable? Were there people that could sight read this style of notation, or is it rather a matter of long contemplation?
I think it's perfectly readable if you are used to reading it, but I actually don't know who was reading it. I don't know whether that was a practice, or whether it was much more a notation of what was played for posterity.
Very interesting. And you said that now turning to other things, and forgive the naive questions, but so turning to other things, how is it preserved? How do we know about it? You spoke about the different tunings. Is this a matter of also reconstruction based on physical parameters of the instruments, or was there some theoretical work that's left for us in the archives? Companion to the well-tempered tuning in Europe. So some of the tunings that are somehow preserved for that style of music. How do we know?
This is another area that there's specialist work underway. It seems likely that in the mid-19th century, for example, or during the 19th century, there was less divergence than there is now between, for example, Turkey and Iran. But something happened in Turkey. Something happened in what was then the Ottoman center. And this became highly theorized, in particular in the 1920s, I'm saying now, in Turkey, so that the pitch space was divided up into, that one tone is divided now into 9 commas, and musicians are expected to be able to hear 5 commas and 4 commas and 1 comma and 8 commas. So all these areas within the space of one tone are there to be heard. If you learn music in Iran or Egypt, the sounds are much more similar to one another, and they're not like that Turkish system. It's more like a quarter tone. That doesn't mean it's always a fixed quarter. There's a lot of inflection, but it's much more like a quarter tone. So there are fewer notes, if you like. Of course, the fretting is something that comes up a lot. So, well, how do you deal with a fretted instrument then? And it's about the positioning of the frets. So there can be frets in key places, and you don't need to fret like a piano. You move the frets according to the mode in which you're playing. And you can, even within a fret, perhaps offer some fluctuation to the pitch. Yes.
And this is very interesting. So your training, I presume, and I think was in Western music, in
my original, yeah, absolutely.
The original training. And so having been, so to say, formatted in terms of your neurology with the 12 tones and the well-tempered tuning, more or less, how does it feel now, having lived in this other tradition, not just of performance and of music, but really of the foundational division of pitches? And how has your ear adjusted? And can you talk about that a bit?
At the beginning, I couldn't really hear them. I mean, I could hear that something was happening, but I didn't know what. For example, when right at the start, when I was learning the oud, I had a teacher who would play phrases that I had to play back. So that kind of imitation of short phrases is one of the ways in which you learn in these traditions. And when a phrase began on one of the notes of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, I could start the phrase at least and usually finish somewhere. But when it began on one of these notes that I didn't know, I couldn't start the phrase, I couldn't find it. There was something in my brain that couldn't actually understand it and grasp it. Now, for me, those notes are super clear. I mean, they're unmistakable. I know what they are, where they are, what they're doing. So there has been a journey, of course. I can also hear whether the player is from Iraq or Istanbul. You know, those sorts of differences are now in there. So I hear someone playing and, oh, it's an Iraqi, or that's also to do with the style, but the tuning is a very fundamental part of that. I still get the tuning wrong. So because I play with musicians from different Middle Eastern traditions, I'm frequently wrong. So my most recent interest is Persian music, and it's very particular, but I feel I'm sort of getting there. But at the same time, when I meet up with a Turkish musician and we play, I can no longer play in tune with her. So there's a sort of acclimatization that happens in whichever context I place myself, but I'm not really rooted in them. Yeah.
And now that you've soaked yourself, though, in this in this tradition, in this multitude of sounds, does Western music sound strange or out of tune? I mean, I don't mean the music, but the tuning and the sort of the basic sound. Does it sound strange? Does it sound out of tune? Does it sound like your other home and you just kind of switch back and forth between these two modes? Or
yeah, I do. Yeah, I switch back and forth. I mean, there's the world of harmony, right? So I respond very, very strongly to harmony, and
but it hasn't altered your perception of Western harmony, so to say. When you start hearing Western harmony, you're in Western harmony listening mode.
That's right. Yeah, that doesn't create a problem. What I do find is that if I find it very difficult to play equal temperament on the oud. So I just can't play in tune, really. If I have to play sort of chromatic music, the thinking and the hand positions are modal.
Fascinating. And you said before that these tunings would be different in different regions, but do you think, because I think you mentioned that a person playing that first piece, the notated piece from Istanbul and from somewhere else, that they would have different, even the microtones would have been different, do you think they would have recognized, though, oh, he's playing that piece, though he's from somewhere else? Or would it be so different that they wouldn't recognize it?
Yeah, I think they would know. I mean, music travels, right? And I mean, one of the things that is very clear in this whole space is that melodies travel and they get taken up. New texts put onto them, and new tunings in many respects. So I know certain songs which are actually in different modes in different countries. Maybe they've been in different modes at different times. We can read from some of the earliest Arabic texts about the Persians arriving, or the Persian slaves singing in a new style, and that then getting taken up by the Arab musicians, or playing Persian melodies on an Arabic oud. These sorts of things. There has long been an awareness of different styles. Intonation is slightly harder to grasp at that distance, of course. And I think we're at a time when we can listen through all this technology now. We can listen to all the traditions we want to that have been recorded and compare them. We can even use software to analyze them. So we can think in this much more categorical way about bounded regions and bounded traditions. And it's also become something that's needed for marketing, to say that you play in a certain school. You see this in the Western classical. No, there's the Russian school. And
nobody knows what it is, but it's printed everywhere.
So we have the same thing.
Yeah. So unfortunately, it's a human phenomenon. Oh well. And these. So you spoke about the rhythmic patterns that can be so long that, in fact, it's useful to think of them as structural, sort of architectural elements. How strict are the guidelines for these, and for as well as for the modes? You know, how regulated are they?
In the Ottoman case, it's there's an enormous amount of notation, and it's very strict. I mean, composers writing at the court would have been composing for musicians, and for musicians who are playing the kudum, this particular percussion which has these different sounds, and so they would have been writing on those cycles. Now, those musicians would have been sitting playing these cycles all day. I mean, it's pretty unthinkable now to imagine the capacity to play in 128 beats in the morning, and then, you know, have a break, and then start playing in 7, and then go and play in 10, and then play in 16, and then play, you know, this type of, they must have embodied those rhythmic cycles by repeating them endlessly. So in that sense, they were strict because there were people that managed to embody them, that had the patterns inside themselves, and those were then written down. These days, there aren't that many people that can afford to spend that time in that way. On the other hand, they are there as ways of understanding melody. So if you study those principles of rhythm, then you understand the shape of the melody. So when it comes to
how does that work? The understanding of melody through these rhythmic shapes.
That's an interesting question, because for me it seems very obvious. I mean, thinking from a Western classical perspective for a moment, I mean, if you're playing a waltz, the melody is part of the gesture of the waltz, no? Same if you have a polonaise, it's got a gesture, it's got a movement that's associated with it. The same is true of these Ottoman rhythms. So the Samai, the one I mentioned before, this 10, the fact that the pattern is perhaps dom, tek, dum, dum, tek. That's 10. So dum, 2, 3, tek, 5. Dum, dum, tek, 9, 10. So dum, and then tek, dum, dum, tek, and then it may get elaborated. But that heavy dum, as it's called, and then the tek has a movement. Now the melody will have been written in response to that. At the start of any piece, it's likely to be with it. And then there will be moments where it goes against it. It flows through in a different way. It cross-cuts. And that is the beauty of it. Now, if you don't understand what's happening, if you don't understand that the melody at that point is changing its relationship with the underlying movement of the piece, then you're missing one of the expressive potentials of that melody. So that's what I mean. Is that strict? Well, yes, it's good to know the strict formula, and then you can play with that. When it comes to the mode, that's a bit different. I mean, the mode is very strict in the post-Ottoman Turkish world and Greek. If you go to the Arab world, Egypt, Damascus, you're likely to find something more flexible and less codified. And in the Iranian space, again, it's really extremely strict. So there are certain spaces that you pass through when you are building a melody and when you build a suite of pieces. If you're trying to do something within the tradition, you don't need to be in the tradition, but if you want to follow the tradition, then it's extremely codified. Yes.
And you've done work on Hungarian music. You've studied in Hungary. Obviously, a question on the surface is Bartók and his travels to Turkey, or to the, let's say, the Ottoman Lebensraum, and I assume you have looked into that and examined his, say, conclusions or impressions of that music tradition. Can you talk a little bit about that, or has it not been an area that you have been interested to explore?
It's a funny thing that I haven't gone back into that in that way, but it's something certainly I should do. So to see, yes, what his recordings sound like now, and what kind of conceptualization he came up with for that. I mean, Bartók was a phenomenal listener. So the sort of hearing and intelligence that he brought is, I'm sure I will be impressed all over again. But of course, things have moved on, and I have a different listening possibility than Bartók had. So that would be interesting. I mean, this limping rhythm that I mentioned is a case in point. And there's actually quite a lot of new research on these so-called limping rhythms. A new category that's being used is ovoid. So ovular, like, rather than thinking of a movement around a circle in which there's just one center and it goes round, and thinking of this kind of lopsided movement, or different centers. So the thing that he was struggling to theorize at that time is still a matter of debate, even though maybe it's not happening so much in the areas he was looking at, but more in Central Asia. Yeah.
And with your enviable outlook on these differing and different traditions, what's your impression of the this unevenness? I mean, you talked about limping now, but the sort of the version of the not inégal, the inégalité in this tradition. versus the classical, and how much is it similar? How much do you think it comes from the basic sort of biological need for some pleasant unevenness rather than the uniform evenness?
Yeah, I would certainly go along with that. I mean, notation can be a starting point. It's normal in the traditions in which I play to treat the score as a starting point. There's a lot that isn't notated. You dot some of the rhythms inevitably to create the variety. The variety isn't written into the score, you make it.
That's perhaps a good slogan for classical music students too. The variety isn't written into the score. Well, partly it is, but in which ways? And for a second, so one more technical question that came to my mind about the frets versus no frets, and when they disappear, when they come in. Can you illuminate that a little bit?
Well, the oldest sources we have about the literary or the historical sources, theoretical sources about the oud refer to the frets, and very specifically the positions of the frets in terms of finger distances, measurements, and what sounds they produced in terms of Pythagorean divisions of a fundamental note. So we know how they were tuned, and we know where the frets went. And gradually frets were added. And this can be traced in the literature. What's slightly strange is that in the iconography, there are no frets. So some scholars have said, well, there weren't any frets because you can see in the pictures. And the frets were added to the lutes because the Europeans had harmony and they needed to be more precisely in tune with equal temperament. But evidently there were frets, and they were tied, they were gut, just like the strings were gut. It's not clear when they were then taken off, but my hunch would be that just as Europe was becoming more complex in terms of harmony, then under the Ottomans and perhaps the Persians, there was more complexity in terms of the horizontal dimension of music, more complexity in terms of modal structures, forming modes. And under the Sultan, as I mentioned, this thing of a way of, you could be paid if you come up with a good mode. So it's in your interest to codify. And then that codification sort of, it gets more and more complex, it becomes a pain. You need sort of 8 different instruments to be able to play in 8 different modes. It's not practical. So just untie the frets, get rid of them.
That makes sense.
I mean, there's a very interesting area here, which is after the Ottoman Empire, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, with the population exchange between what was then Greece and Turkey, and this division that was created there. In Greece, the politics were very, very westward looking, completely to the suppression of all the traditions that were actually alive among the Greek-speaking people of the Ottoman Empire that were moved to Greece. So all those people sort of had to suppress that tradition in the interest of making a modern state. But outside the capital, outside the big cities, of course, traditional Greek music was still sung, and it was still played on the lyra, on unfretted instruments. And so those modes were preserved. And then in the 1970s, though, there was a gradual revival of Ottoman sounds, a gradual revival of instruments. The oud was part of this revival. The oud hadn't been really played in Greece for decades. And then it was a sort of second generation thing. So people went back to what their grandmothers or their grandfathers had used to sing, or what they'd heard as children, and they wanted to hear those sounds. They connected to them. It became part of recovery of that Eastern identity. And then they wanted to listen to the lira players and the singers in order to get those intervals back. And they put them on the unfretted instruments such as the lute, the oud. But in the meantime, they'd also been playing fretted instruments such as the lute and strumming. So in Greece, there is a kind of coexistence of the microtonal melodic line with quite a basic, often drone-like, or basic harmonic movements underneath with fretted instruments.
And then, of course, you mentioned Greece. It would be a grave omission not to mention Armenia and the whole complexity that I'm sure also the music and the music instruments were caught up in the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, the First World War, the Armenian genocide, and I imagine this could be also a factor even for what choice of instruments and inheritance that would have been played in Greece or in.
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at one of the things I didn't talk about was the fact that we know that the lute died out in Europe. Well, the oud died out in the Ottoman Empire, so that by sort of it came up for a revival 250 years after having been removed from the court towards the end of the 19th century. And that's likely partly a result of Arab visitors to the court. So the Khedive sending from Cairo some musicians to the Ottoman court. But there were instrument makers in the city who were probably making instruments not for the court, but for domestic use. And some of the most active and the most celebrated were Armenians. So Armenian instrument builders made lutes, made ouds at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century as well. Some of the most distinguished ouds of the late Ottoman period were made by Armenians and Greeks. After the dispersal of many, many Armenians throughout the world, you see the rise of Armenian oud playing, particularly prominently in the United States. And the name Hagopian, and my mind is going blank, but there are some very leading Armenian oud players in the United States, and also from the late Ottoman era. I'm sure there are listeners who are wanting to shout at me the names. My mind is blank. But what is also interesting is then where Armenian identity is expressed. So I've also read the experience of one American Armenian who has said that she never liked the sound of the oud because for her it was the sound of the Ottomans. It was the sound of the Turks. So for her, it was the sound of the other that she had sort of expelled. So it's a very complex area.
Yes, it's a very fraught issue and question. And not to overlook, you mentioned this quite a lot in your presentation, the role of women. And of course, it would be, and very briefly and modestly, you mentioned your own experience as a woman coming to this tradition, studying it. But it would be interesting to hear more your experiences of coming into it as a female player, and also your experience of coming into this tradition from a very different culture. So in that sense, so as an outsider. What have the experiences been like and have you felt welcomed, or were there difficult episodes where you felt that there's a barrier of authenticity that you're allowed to partake in?
it's difficult to position yourself as somebody with a sort of major professional existence, and also decades of very serious study of the piano. So on the one hand, sort of sense of knowing what I'm doing, and then another holding an object in my lap that I feel completely idiotic with. So there's a very strange dynamic. And my first teacher was actually a master's student at SOAS, University of London, and I was a professor in a different London university, and I started going to him for lessons. It's a very strange dynamic. And out of respect for me, he gave me some extremely difficult pieces to play. And that showed, that he wanted me to have a shot. But of course, I couldn't get near them. And what I really needed to be doing was playing notes, just single notes, and working out, therefore, what it felt like. And there are many aspects to it. The oud is a very intimate instrument in that it's not like the piano where you turn up and get on with it, that whatever the piano is, you have to make the best of it and play it. And I'm used to that, arriving at it for a concert and, oh my goodness, this is what it is, all right. And then you do your thing and then you leave. That's what I sort of thought, that's what I was used to. But it's a different thing when you start to try to choose an instrument for yourself that you can't yet play. And there's a strange alchemy of the balancing of the instrument on your lap. There's working out how to make sure that this part of the hand can be free, which depends very much on whether you can, rest your arm on this part of the instrument, and that depends on the curve of the back, as well as the height of the instrument and its depth. All these things are very difficult, and I didn't deal with enough at the beginning. And partly the reason I didn't deal with it enough at the beginning is that I didn't study properly. So I wasn't in the mood to really have the regular weekly lessons, which is what I really should have done. And instead I sort of threw myself around and did this course and that course and did all sorts of intensive workshops. I haven't felt that I belong. I've felt quite welcomed, but I haven't felt kind of recognized, because I think fundamentally because I'm not a man. I do think that there's a very strong sense, and I've got blonde hair. I mean, I'm all wrong. There's the orientalist gaze from Europe, but there's also the gaze that comes back, and I don't fit. So I've found in very recent times, actually working with female teachers, that something falls into place that didn't before, and perhaps perhaps the gender thing is more powerful than anything else. I don't know. I certainly haven't had any hostile experiences. I think I've had enormously generous teachers that I've been able to go to and spend time with. In Istanbul, for example, the very distinguished player and teacher Necati Çelik, he just welcomed me. He said, yes, you should come every day, you should play and just work here. And he sort of cultivated that. So I've had a lot of generosity, but I blame myself as much as I blame the cultural spaces I've tried to enter, that there's been something holding me back always. My job, for example, I can't just go and sit at the feet of an oud teacher and study, or a temperamental thing. So in the end, I think I worked most on the Ottoman tradition because there was so much notated music that I could work on myself. I could study the repertoire, I could listen, and that it had a depth of tradition that I was drawn to in notated sources.
And was this your first foray into improvisation? Was through learning the oud, or was there an experience in improvising before on the piano or in the Western tradition for you?
Actually, it was my first serious attempt. Yes, yeah, and that's a pity. I think I really think it's a pity that that's gone from the way Western classical music, except for organists. I mean, organists, of course, learn to extemporize in the tradition, but that's really gone in the classical traditions. Yeah.
Yes, this is a chapter for another seminar. But yes, indeed, my early experience of trying to enter a very different tradition culturally, and one that so included improvisation, was learning to play jazz, and I feel that was very important to see that music does not come from just one source, which is some printed dots on the page that you try to have a religious attitude towards. So
I mean, there's another sort of, there's an addendum, I suppose, which is that it's also the first time I've played in a tradition in which the audience contributes. So the first time I played a concert, actually, in the rehearsal, I could barely play the instrument, but I was asked to contribute to a charity event. And so it was going to be oud and a percussionist only. And the percussionist came over to rehearse, and I attempted to improvise something, and he called out across the room, "Allah!" And I mean, I was so shocked that I nearly dropped the oud. But he was doing it in a slightly ironic way. He's not religious, and his background is his family background is Christian. But there is a tradition in listening, which is to express appreciation at certain moments of certain types of phrase, and you might do it by saying "ah," or "ya'in," your eyes, or you might say "Allah, Allah, Allah, Allah." It's a way of participating in the musical exploration that's happening.
So
and you can
dead
hear
silence
it. You can hear it in the recording.
Not the only way to participate. Yes, it's wonderful.
Yeah. So that may mean that if you are developing an improvisation, which is actually a melodic development, let's call it. It's not really an improvisation. If you're developing a melody, you may have to wait for the audience to finish infusing before you start the next section. And that may also be a kind of give you the nice feedback, like in a jazz gig, where there's a feedback going on. And of course, that's what we all miss in the Zoom world we're now in, most painfully perhaps. But it's a very different culture from the Western classical, where you sit reverentially and silently and suppress your coughs and leave in deep shame if you can't control your cough.
Well, there hasn't been any coughing for the past year anyway, so nobody coughs suddenly unless you're
We're not allowed to cough anymore.
Unless you're ill, because then they take you away. But on the other hand, we know that in the 19th century, we're not so far away from the time that in classical music also an audience would burst out in applause after a beautiful turn of phrase. Even Casals says that, sometimes people would applaud after a nice passage. So, so perhaps some of that will come back. Maybe we touched upon it, but maybe one final question as we go towards you in some way more and more from the large tradition. It would be interesting for me to know how did this come about that you thought I'll study the oud, or was it just you were struck by the sound and you thought this, or what happened and how? Yeah,
so it was a long gestation and completely unexpected, I have to say, and very unstrategic. It was I think it's 2003 when I was still working on Hungarian music. Maybe I was finishing up my book, and there was an article in the Observer, the leading article, I think, which was talking about Daniel Barenboim having set up a music school in Ramallah, and also the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. And I was very provoked by the article and another one that came out at roughly the same time. And I think the title of the article was "Suddenly Classical Music Has Become Sexy Again." And then there was something
I'm
about,
sure some editor was excited about that.
Yeah, and then there was this, and then Barenboim takes music to the Arabs. That was the other thing. So it was strange because from a newspaper that I associated with sort of left-wing liberal values, or this very imperialistic presentation of what was going on, and also highly commercialized. So I filed it, this article, or these articles, and thought, okay, later. And then I started following the career of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, and I managed to raise some money to do a study, actually, of the orchestra, what was going on. I wanted to know what it was like being inside. And I did a lot of interview work. I was with the orchestra for one summer. And then I started to build out, because during that time I learned from a lot of the participants that there was actually quite a strong Western classical music culture in Egypt, even in Damascus. So there were centers, there were conservatoires, and they came from families of musicians. And so I then became, so then I managed to get another research grant and went to Israel and the West Bank to explore how Western classical music was being developed among Arab communities, and why. So those are the sorts of questions I went with. And those questions remained a research focus, although I took a historical view. I started tracing back to the missionary movements of the 19th century to understand where these sensibilities came from. So these Palestinians who, for example, saw choral singing as crucial to their existence, where that came from, or why people learned the violin and wanted to play Mozart, and understanding those sensibilities. So I then did a lot of work on the missionary world and Palestine under the Mandate. And but in the meantime, as I was visiting and doing a lot of archival work and interviewing, I was introduced, my very first time through some connections, I was introduced to a Palestinian Israeli citizen. He came from the Galilee originally. He was living in Jerusalem then. He was an oud player and oud teacher. And I went round to chat to him, and he showed me this, this instrument was there, and it kind of, I noticed. And then we became friends, and each time I visited, he'd bought more instruments. And he was becoming essentially an oud collector of historical instruments. And I was completely mesmerized by these instruments. They all had a different sound, a different story, a different character. Now, at this time I was living in Berlin, and quite by chance, I had a group of friends there who were, some of them were Syrians, and we would get together, and when we got together, the Syrians would always sing, and it worked best if there was an oud, of course. Sometimes there'd be a guitar, but there would always be something. And as this went on and I was preparing to move back to London, I thought, well, actually, I'd quite like to reproduce this in London. So the next time I was in Israel, I got my friend to help me find a secondhand oud, and I bought this oud, and then I moved back to London with it. But it's a funny thing, an instrument. It kind of started pulling me in, and I found myself trying to play it increasingly. And I can now see that that instrument was way too big for me. I mean, it was a huge Arab instrument, and I was probably playing like this. But that's where I started. And then it became really a way of meeting a lot of different people in London from the ones that I would have done anyway. It became a fascinating social tool as well as a new musical tool. And it went from there. I mean, my research then became more and more focused on the different types of oud that have been made, and for whom and why and what stories they tell. But playing it was obviously just something I did because I'm a musician.
That's beautiful and very organic. And this research about this colonization through Western music being exported, is that published? Have you published this?
Yeah, that's the Cambridge book, the 2009, I think, Orientalism and Musical Mission.
That's the one. I see. And when is this forthcoming book due to be out? The one that you're writing about the oud. When can we?
Yeah, I'd kind of yes, I'd kind of set it aside, and it might never have happened, but then COVID struck, so I am actually writing it. So I hope to deliver it to the publisher in the next few months. Certainly, sort of autumn. And
so that's something.
So I very much hope it'll be out next year. Yes, it's not an academic book, although it's based on years of academic work. It's a book for the interested reader. It's a very different sort of book from those I've written before.
Well, I think everybody that was here today, I would imagine, is a converted, interested reader. I certainly want to know more about it, and it's been wonderful to have this introduction, but it felt deeper than just an introduction because of your deep knowledge of the subject. So I'm very grateful. It's very mind expanding. So I want to thank you for spending these couple hours with us, and for the presentation, and also for all the responses to my questions. So just for those of you that are interested, next week is Deborah Bordam, who is the CEO of the New York Philharmonic, visionary orchestra leader, and she'll talk in a way that I think echoes with what we discussed today about music and music making and musical ensembles as a small representation, as a macrocosm of society. And obviously we've gone through a very turbulent time, are going through a very turbulent time, and I think Deborah has some very strong views and some visionary answers. So join us, sign up for the newsletter, and I hope you'll come back both as a participant and again as a presenter in this series. But I wanted to thank you for this visit today.
Thank you, Kirill, for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. Stay healthy, and
you too.
See you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.